Welcome, everyone. I'm Lori McVitie, and I'm going to be moderating today on a panel entitled Web Attacks and Fraud Lessons Learned from the Deep End of the Pool. And to help me are two people, security experts, who have been in that deep end of the pool. I have with me Sarah Body, Senior Director of F5 Labs Threat Intelligence Reporting Division, and Dan Woods, VP of the Shape Intelligence Center. Now, Dan, you have a very storied background. So I'd like you to start and just give us an introduction and explain where you've been in that deep end of the pool.
Well, I guess I started my career more than 25 years ago working a beat as a patrol officer. And I had a real passion for computer crimes. So I went to college, studied computer systems engineering at Arizona State, and then I was dispatched to my very first computer crime as a patrol officer. When I got to the crime scene, unfortunately, I learned somebody had thrown a laptop through a window, so it wasn't exactly the type of computer crime I was hoping for. So I realized that I wasn't going to be getting the sorts of computer crimes I wanted to as a patrol officer. So I left and joined CIA as a cyber operations officer. That was a great job. I traveled all over the world, helping our human intelligence assets, collect information of interest to policymakers. But then at 36 and a half years old, I realized that if I didn't go to FBI, I could never go to FBI because, as many in the audience likely know, FBI as an age requirement, you have to be 37 or younger than 37 by the time you finish the academy. Otherwise, they're not going to hire you. So they discriminate based on age, and it's perfectly legal. So I went to FBI as a special agent for a few years, working cyber terrorism cases. Then went back to CIA as a contractor, and then years later, I joined Shape. And, at Shape, we're protecting organizations from automated attacks. And frankly, that was pretty jaw-dropping. And then F5 acquired Shape just last year, and I've been part of the F5 family ever since, and been loving it.
Awesome. Sarah has a very interesting title, right? Threat Intelligence and Reporting Division. So what does that mean? And how are you complementary to Dan? Because you really are listening to your conversations.
Yeah. It's making me realize, Lori, I probably should have went first because Dan's a pretty tough act to follow. His bio is absolutely fascinating, and it's equally fascinating to listen to the stories you have to tell, Dan. So I'm excited to do a panel with you. A little bit about my background. I started out in the information security industry, late 90s. I worked for a boutique network security consulting firm in Seattle. And then right before, I worked in the consulting industry for a long time, and then I got into operational security. So before I came to F5, I was the VP of Information Security and Business Intelligence at a company called Demand Media. I think what has come up most in my career in cybersecurity outside of compliance is business just not understanding risk and the willingness to take on too much risk. And as a result, throughout my career, I've dealt with a lot of incident response. And that's actually what led me to threat intelligence. I think a lot of people in the operational security world get really burned out defending all the time, especially, with the ongoing onslaught of attacks that they're constantly defending, breaches they have to investigate, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to look at the problem differently, which is what got me into threat intelligence. So about 5 years ago, I came to F5 to start F5 Labs, which is our threat intelligence reporting division. And the reason why I say threat intelligence reporting division is because there's tons of teams across F5 that do threat intelligence. We have to. If you think about the security products that we support, everybody has to be looking at attacks, writing signatures for WAFs, for instance. That's the most simple example. But there's lots of different teams across F5, including Dan's, that do a lot of threat intelligence. And so we aggregate that and report out on it. So that's what my team does in relation to how we work with Dan. And I would just say, in terms of my contribution to this conversation, I'm really passionate about educating people about cybersecurity. I think we need more education in this space, especially people outside of the security profession, the business people that we talk to on a regular basis, to be successful with security. So I think that's where, the audience will probably see me the most contributing to this conversation. So
Your passion shows, Sarah. I've watched many of your presentations and always come away having learned a lot.
I try to be.
I agree with Dan. I've watched you many times give keynotes and be on panels, and you're just very passionate. Even just having conversations about what we wanted to talk about in this webinar, right? You were very passionate about what you wanted to say, how you wanted to say it. It's been a fascinating adventure. And I think one of the things you alluded to when you were talking there, right, is really about complexity. That, right, the complexity of attacks, the complexity of infrastructure, applications, just the environments that we're working in is so incredible today that it's really hard to get a handle on, right, security. Where do I start? And I think one of the lessons that I've learned from Dan, and I'd love for him to dive into it, is kind of the simplification of vulnerabilities, understanding the difference between what he calls inherent vulnerabilities and inadvertent, because those provide different means of protection, right? You have to deal with them differently. So Dan, could you explain the difference there and how you kind of simplify those categories so we can dive into them?
Yeah, you're right, Lori. It is very complex. So for somebody like me, I like to just really simplify it, make it really easy to understand. And I think breaking these vulnerabilities into those two categories, inherent vulnerabilities and inadvertent vulnerabilities, makes a lot of sense. The inadvertent vulnerabilities are the types of vulnerabilities that result from, mistakes, from configuration errors, from programming mistakes. These are the OWASP top 10, right? The cross-site scripting and SQL injection. These are things that can be patched. They can be corrected through better security hygiene. The inherent vulnerabilities are different. They cannot be patched in a traditional sense. For example, you are vulnerable to a credential stuffing attack where a bad actor takes usernames and passwords from the spill or from the dark web and just tries them programmatically against your login application. You're vulnerable to those because you have a login application. So they're really just abusing the functionality the way it was intended to be used. So you not like you could take down the login application, right? You need to offer your customers an ability to create accounts, log into accounts, maybe go through a forgot password workflow. And they result from a critical business requirement. So that's how I like to think about it. The inadvertent vulnerabilities and the inherent vulnerabilities. And what Shape specializes in is protecting enterprises from those from exploits that attack the inherent vulnerabilities.
Can I give a little context here on how the breach root cause landscape has shifted in relation to Dan's point? I love the way you frame this up, Dan. I think this is the right way to simplify the conversation, especially when you're trying to talk about risk with business people. So we do analysis on the root cause of breaches. And the primary root cause of breaches from like the late 90s through 2018 was a result of inadvertent vulnerabilities. So like what Dan said, configuration mistakes. One of the primary root cause of breaches prior to 2018 was SQL injection, right? Which is 20-year-old vulnerability that we still have challenges with. What we saw in a large analysis of over a decade of breaches prior to 2018, the research concluded in 2017 actually, was that whereas the primary root cause of breaches was inadvertent web application misconfigurations and not secure coding, we saw that so much data had been collected on people, especially citizens of the United States, that we expected access-related attacks to become the number one root cause of breaches simply because attackers had so much data, they could power access attacks a lot more effectively. We said that username and password should be treated as public, including social security numbers, and we anticipated to see a shift in the root cause of breaches away from web application exploits into primary access targeted attacks like phishing and credential stuffing. And that shift actually happened in 2018. There was a big shift from web-related attacks to access-related attacks as being the primary root cause of breaches, and that's been consistent ever since. So we're done with the 2020 root cause analysis of breaches, and access attacks again are the majority, over 50%. You are seeing a little bit of shift in the breach root cause landscape due to ransomware, but again, it's landing through phishing and email related attacks because of data that attackers already have on people. And during that period of time since 2018, we saw a 200% rise in in breaches that resulted in credential spills. So now credential stuffing is the number one attack type. So when we're talking about risk and we're talking about a shift from inadvertent configuration errors to inherent vulnerabilities, targeting access related services because they already have credentials, that's the biggest risk that all companies have to face right now. It's the primary way that they're getting breached.
And that's kind of scary because, I mean, between automation and scripts and being able to leverage technology, right? Attackers can just, I mean, go crazy against those kinds of services, right? And Dan, you have an interesting story about that, don't you? About learning more about that whole scene, kind of the deeper, darker end of the pool.
Well, I think the best way to kind of describe the tools that attackers use is to talk about how attackers evolve kind of from low sophistication to a high sophistication, and then all the way to human click farms. So they'll typically start using tools like curl or Sentry MBA, which, they're not browsers. They just replicate the network traffic that a browser generates. So there are no mouse movements or keystrokes, but they're able to fool Origin into thinking they're an actual browser because the network traffic is identical. And these are capable of launching huge, large volume, large velocity attacks in the billions, in a day or two, in the billions. So very, very significant volumes of attack. These are also pretty easy to defeat. A simple JavaScript challenge will defeat all of those network layer tools. And then when you mitigate based on some attribute that the attacker can't change, in other words, not by IP address or user agent or region or autonomous system, those sorts of things, then they need to evolve. They need to become more sophisticated. And typically what we see them do is use tools like headless browsers or MIT Sakuli or Selenium. So these are real browsers that are being programmatically controlled. And in the beginning, they're not very good at impersonating humans. Maybe the mouse movements of keystrokes are very synthetic, maybe too fast to be human, or the mouse is moving in a straight line. Again, if they're mitigated and those attacks fail, by the way, if they're successful, then they don't evolve anymore. There's just no reason to invest in tooling if your attack is successful. But Shape, we don't block by attributes that attackers can change very quickly. So we see them evolve even more. They get much better at impersonating humans. There's a lot of entropy in their mouse movements and keystrokes. They're better at spoofing devices. So, for example, maybe the user agent string purports to be a Samsung device. In the beginning, they just purport to be a Samsung device, but they're not doing floating point math like a Samsung device. They're not rendering emojis like a Samsung device. So we can tell that they're spoofing. But over time, as these attacks continue to get mitigated, they get more and more sophisticated, much, much better at spoofing devices and imitating humans. And then ultimately, when none of those attacks work, they resort to human click farms. So that's kind of how attackers evolve from, kind of low sophistication network level attacks through headless browsers, remotely controlling actual browsers, and then all the way to human click farms.
Oh, one thing I didn't hear in any of that was any discussion about 2FA, right? We hear about 2FA all the time. It's even in video games, right? 2FA, Fortnite actually entices everyone, right? They reward you for enabling 2FA by giving you some kind of free digital content in game, which gets kids used to using 2FA. So isn't 2FA like the solution then to defeating the click farms or the people trying to pretend to be someone they're not? I mean, Sarah, do you have any insights on that? Why is 2FA not working?
I think Dan has a great example, or has a great answer for that specific question. I think for the most part, 2FA is still a very valuable control in your multi-layered defense strategy, right? Defense in depth, you've got to have lots of different controls to deal with various forms of access-related attacks. We know that sophisticated actors can bypass 2FA. I still think it doesn't mean get rid of 2FA. It means we need to evolve how we deal with access control at scale. We need to get rid of username and passwords. I think a lot of us have ideas about how we need to evolve access control as a whole across the internet. I think we still have some valuable controls. 2FA is one of them, but let's not kid ourselves. Advanced attackers can get around it. But Dan, I know you have some specific examples here too.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sarah, that it does play a very important role in security, but widespread and mandatory use of 2FA, I think, is just a bit burdensome on customers, especially the elderly. Now, with our government using common access cards, there's a cost associated with distributing and maintaining those, replacing lost ones. But, using a hardware or software token 2FA will prevent credential stuffing. There's no doubt about it. Now, most implementations of 2FA, however, I see are text message and email based. And Lori, as you alluded to, we are seeing bad actors circumvent that by a variety of means, whether it be SS7 compromises, social engineering, port outs or SIM swaps, or malware on cell phones. They are seriously targeting those sorts of applications that are 2FA protected. And those implementations, by the way, they don't stop credential stuffing, because when you enter in the correct username and password, then and only then are you asked to enter the second factor of authentication. If you enter in the incorrect username and password, you're told incorrect username and password. So that difference in server response tells the attacker whether or not the credentials are good. Now, admittedly, they haven't taken over the account, but they now know the credentials are good, and then can partner with somebody who specializes in defeating that second factor of authentication. So yes, 2FA plays an important role in security. It always will. But at Shape, we like to make sure our customers are using it very sparingly when necessary for high-risk transactions, rather than for every transaction, because it just creates too much friction.
Yeah, I agree totally. That's your inadvertent information disclosure vulnerability there, Dan, like you're talking about. I mean, I think it has diminishing value when you start using 2FA for customer logins, especially at scale, and especially dealing with the general population of internet consumers that, are going to struggle with it. I think it has diminishing returns. I think everybody would argue that 2FA is still a good control for network access and employee access, remote access, right? But I totally agree with you. It's got diminishing returns from a consumer access control standpoint. And that's an opportunity for this industry to innovate for sure. And I think we've got some room for innovation. When we look at the attack landscape shifting, it's attacker innovation, not necessarily us getting better at defending, with the exception of new modern AI-enabled controls, for instance, Shape.
Yeah, in fact, we like to refer to it as continuous authentication, rather than there just be this gate where they enter in a username and password and 2FA code and they are quote unquote authenticated. We like to continuously authenticate it using many of the signals we collect. That is a frictionless way at providing a comparable level of security.
Absolutely. Zero trust principle.
That's a good point. Zero trust and the frictionless, right? That's part of why 2FA is so difficult for some people. Either they don't have a phone or they can't figure it out. They can't get to their email. It can be frustrating even just to use that as a mechanism to, right, prove who you are. But I mean, CAPTCHA, we know CAPTCHA doesn't work, right? So if 2FA isn't working, I mean, enterprises have to do something to protect against this. So what is your advice, right? If you're an enterprise, how do you evolve your security to meet some of these, right, modern sophisticated attacks? And if not get ahead, at least try and keep up and protect your customers, right? Because the data is really important. We've all been compromised, but there's still a lot of data that hasn't been compromised. What can we do to keep that safe?
Well, Lori, real quick, you mentioned in passing that we all know CAPTCHA doesn't work, but I think many people in the audience think CAPTCHA does work. It's
for who, Dan? For who?
Correct them. Tell us why it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for me. I'll tell you that.
Yeah,
I can't pass one of them damn tests.
No.
Yeah, neither could I. But I've gotten better at it. I actually went to work for a Russian human click farm known as 2CAPTCHA. I went through their training, and they give you a test to make sure you can solve CAPTCHAs quickly enough. And I almost wasn't hired. I almost could not solve the CAPTCHAs quickly enough, but thankfully my 16-year-old daughter helped me solve a few of the CAPTCHAs. And I was hired, and I started solving CAPTCHAs for, I believe, probably for people who are using automation to circumvent CAPTCHAs. So I was the human solving those CAPTCHAs. I had solved maybe, 15, 20, maybe 30 of them, I don't remember. And I hadn't even earned 1 penny US yet. So these are really, they exploit impoverished regions, low income folks who are just going to work, 10, 15-hour days and make $3 US. It's really tragic. But as long as there are humans that are willing to sit in front of a computer or on their phone all day long and solve CAPTCHAs, and this is all form of CAPTCHAs, the squiggly lines, the purported so-called fun CAPTCHA where you're turning a gorilla right side up or you're clicking "I'm not a robot," every single CAPTCHA can be defeated because, well, maybe defeated isn't even the right word. I mean, these are humans solving the CAPTCHAs. These are actually humans working for bots. But anyway, when I realized that I hadn't earned that much money, I decided to quit, and I haven't solved CAPTCHAs again. But it was an interesting experience. They did teach me how to solve CAPTCHAs more effectively. So I think I'm up to like a 70% solve rate, which is much, much better.
I love that story. Moral to the story is that CAPTCHA works for attackers, not for legitimate humans.
Yeah, my blood boils every time I encounter one of these CAPTCHAs, and I click "I'm not a robot," and then it's asking me to pick out the fire hydrants or crosswalks from pictures. I don't get it. I wish everybody would just stop using all forms of CAPTCHA. And frankly, our Shape customers do. We go in line, we deploy our signals, we can prevent the unwanted automation without imposing that sort of friction on customers.
Yeah, and we just finished a research project with Dan's team at Shape where we analyzed how credential stuffing. Well, Dan's team analyzed how credential stuffing attacks play out and the different types of tools that attackers use, and we analyzed like the landscape around credential stuffing breaches and what attackers are doing with the credentials. One of the most fascinating things to me was that attackers are using compromised credentials to log into web applications at the same time that legitimate consumers are using those same compromised credentials. And so you kind of have this little bit of a, good guy, bad guy war, who can get in first, who's going to pass the CAPTCHA. And if we think about the likelihood of the legitimate human passing that versus the attacker, it's just another example of where they're a little bit outpacing the good guys.
It's kind of terrifying to think about it, right? We're playing catch up all the time. And I know that my own research, right, at a very high level, is that the fastest growing use of AI right now is in security to protect applications. And I think that's, some of the stories you've told and the failures and the successes and how attackers evolve is one of the reasons why, is because the amount of data that you need to analyze at any given moment in order to say attacker legitimate is so significant that really as a human, it's nearly impossible to do. So is that the future? Is that what enterprises need to do next in order to, right, make that next step of security? Or is there, are there other solutions? Are there other tools they can use that will help them improve their security right now?
Well, I'm a bit biased. I know there are companies that purport they can protect enterprises just by looking at the network layer, looking at, the IP address and the autonomous system. And I've seen too many attackers evolve right past those sorts of defenses. I think the only way to be truly effective against some of the more sophisticated attackers is to collect signals from the device, from the user, from the network, from the environment, and then analyze those signals in real time. That's really key. I mean, you got to look at behavioral biometrics, whether or not. I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating. Looking at how the device does floating point math. That is a signal we developed years ago that's been extremely effective and powerful in identifying attackers. Many of these attackers, they have no idea how to spoof such a signal. So we've used that very effectively to track many, many attackers. So yeah, I think collecting signals is key. And then I guess the second thing that's really, really important that a lot of enterprises overlook is attackers retool. So you have to have a kind of a second stage, your real-time defense looking at the signals, but a second stage that is looking at the last 5 minutes of transactions or the last 30 minutes, the last hour, the last day, looking at aggregate transactions using, your AI ML systems, just to look for any malicious traffic that stage one missed. If you don't have stage two, that retrospective analysis looking at those signals, then you're going to miss a lot of retools. And then I guess the final thing is if you identify something in stage two, you of course need stage one without impacting production traffic. So that's really the key, collecting rich signals, taking real-time action in what we call stage one, and then having AI and ML systems running in the background on aggregate transactions, looking for anything that stage one missed, then update stage one with a new countermeasure. And that continues into perpetuity if you really want to be effective against the motivated and sophisticated attackers.
I totally agree with Dan. And what I'm hearing you say, Dan, is knowing your environment, right? Like that is supposed to be our advantage. We are supposed to know our environments better than attackers and be in a more advantageous position to defend. And I think that's a big part of a defender's challenge right now, because when you talk about network and some of the ways that other security providers, offer defense, especially at a network level, what is your network anymore, right? You've got systems way outside of your ASN because you're in multi-cloud, right? That's part of your network. It's where your systems and your data exist, and it's not going to be under the protection of a perimeter that you manage anymore, right? Well, I guess you do manage the perimeter of systems in the cloud, but that's a huge challenge. It's actually the primary root cause of breaches in the cloud is a lack of access control, like in general, to cloud systems. So like exposed EC2 buckets with no access control at all, no requirement for authorization, nothing, right? So I think it's a big challenge. And I think when you look at the attacker landscape, they're really good at scale because they use automation. And the only way to defend against that is to do the same, automation and scale with security controls. I think we do need to, we have some room for innovation. I think access control is probably the biggest area of opportunity in terms of security at scale. We've got to figure out a way to make zero trust deployable. It's been widely discussed as best practice since Google championed it almost 12 years ago, and we're still in relatively immature phases of deploying access or zero trust programs across enterprises around the world. And so I think it's security at scale. It's leveraging AI and automation to help with that, understanding your environment, tuning custom signatures to your environment. If you don't use, solutions like Shape or SaaS solutions, right? And and it's adopting more cultures of security, right? There's a lot of things you can do from a defensive standpoint with security controls, but you can also start from within. Developing products securely from the get-go, training your developers on secure coding, adopting a culture of security, talking about the value of security more. So we're not still having these conversations about why security is important, because when you talk to a security person, you're like, what do you mean? There's breaches everywhere and you shouldn't trust your own identity anymore. And it's like, you're still fighting that fight of trying to, articulate the value of security to a business. And so I know I threw out a lot of things, but if I could sum up my recommendations, it's go for zero trust, go for automation and scale, go for vendors that have AI and automation that you trust, that have very intelligent teams like yourself, Dan, that are powering those controls, and train your developers on secure coding.
A couple of things you said, Sarah, reminds me of a couple of things that will probably be important to the audience. Look, AI and ML is important, but it's almost become kind of a buzz phrase. Frankly, I hear vendors use and overuse it. If they could just throw in blockchain, it would be the trifecta. In reality, Shape is actually quite good at AI and ML. We're in the top 100 in the world, according to Fortune. We continue to invest tens of millions of dollars into it. And we recognize that it isn't ready to be blindly trusted in making real-time decisions about whether or not to take a mitigating action on a transaction. It just isn't ready to be blindly trusted. You need humans, lots of humans, poring over all those alerts, looking for false positives, looking for false negatives, making sure those systems are learning appropriately. So that's one thing I wanted the audience to hear. When you hear vendors throw around AI and ML, just roll your eyes unless they have dozens of humans to support that AI and ML. So that's really key. And then the other thing is, Sarah, you mentioned, know your environment. Something that is very important is that attacks are not just against login today. Yes, that's the kind of the big daddy of them all, right? Credential stuffing on login. But we are seeing unwanted automation against virtually every public facing application. Against forgot password, against create account. We see fare scraping. We see attacks against the check gift card balance application. Every single public-facing application is under some sort of an attack or unwanted automation. And when it comes to login, it isn't just the consumer logins; it's the employee logins, it's the partner logins, the vendor logins. So, knowing your environment, knowing which applications are vulnerable to attack, is the first step in deploying countermeasures. You have to know where to look to see the unwanted automation. And by the way, this automation, it's coming not from a dozen or 100 IP addresses. These attacks are coming from millions of IP addresses from all over the world. It's really easy to come from a very, very distributed attack infrastructure. And I've noticed security operations centers are quite good at identifying, the top few thousand noisiest IPs, but they miss the long tail of hundreds of thousands of IPs, even millions of IPs, from which there are only 10 or 15 transactions. And typically the majority of the attack is coming from that long tail. So just a couple of things I wanted to mention that Sarah reminded me.
Awesome. What I hear is something that I've said for a long time, which is you can't stop an attack, because you don't control the person that's launching the attack. The only thing you can do is identify it, right? Stop it from doing any harm, but it's still going to come. And I think that's become even more true over the years. Assume you are going to be attacked and then really zero in order to focus your security efforts, right? To maximize what you can do to stop those attacks from being successful.
Yeah, and how you mitigate attacks is important. You don't want to mitigate attacks in a way that the attacker immediately recognizes that he's being mitigated. All that does is incentivize retools. You want to take a mitigating action where the attacker doesn't immediately recognize that his attack has been detected and being mitigated. So, for example, if it's on login, you just want to give the attacker, a failed login page. Because then it looks natural. He doesn't know that he's being mitigated until, of course, he starts using, canary accounts to know whether or not he's being mitigated. But that's typically reserved for the more sophisticated attackers. But the key is to mitigate in a way that they don't immediately recognize. Otherwise, they'll just immediately retool.
I love deception defense, but that could get us into a whole nother 20 minutes of conversation. Mess with them if you can.
Sadly, we only have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
So maybe another time we'll have to dive into that, because this has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. If you just want to take a minute and, give a last word or two to everyone listening, that'd be great. Dan?
I guess I just tell everybody, not just the enterprises that are listening, but the individuals and the family members and the friends and loved ones, never reuse your passwords ever. There's just no reason for it. Always, maybe use a password manager where you just have to remember one really, really strong password, and all the other passwords are very strong. You don't have to remember them. You just copy and paste them into the password field. So if I were to give any advice to anybody, it's tell you, your friends, your family, use a password manager because it's gonna save you a lot of pain in the future.
Awesome.
Yes, please. It'll go a long way in improving the overall health of the internet. It is an ecosystem that we all depend upon. And, again, in my conversation about how breaches occur, the majority of breaches are now occurring through access-related attacks because it's your internet neighbor's breach. where credentials were collected, those credentials were shared against applications that you own, and that's how you got breached from your internet neighbor's breach. So this is really an ecosystem, and it matters to business, and it matters to your personal privacy and your identity. And it doesn't matter if you're a U.S. person with a social security number or somebody in Europe. This is impacting everybody's personal identity as much as it's driving up the cost of products, because businesses are eating the cost of breaches. So this is super, super, super important. I love talking to the consumer space too. And I think we all as security professionals have a role to talk about the value of security and share that information with our friends and family, and try to get consumers to have better internet hygiene, especially with password safes. And I think that'll go a long way in selling security internally too, because businesses will see it as more valuable.
Absolutely. That's always a good point, right? One of the best reasons to educate consumers is because consumers are also employees, right? So really there's no difference. We all need to go out right now and just change our passwords, make sure they're all correct, do a little audit, and get that going. And so I want to thank you for that reminder. I also want to thank you both for being right on this panel and giving us such interesting perspectives and stories and information and advice. It's been really valuable. I've enjoyed it. I hope everybody watching has enjoyed it and learned something and taken something away from it that you can use right tomorrow or right now to start better security. I guess you do better security, right? It's something you do. It's not something we just talk about. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us.